The year was 1946, a time for healing the wounds of war. This is the story of a group of Canadians for whom the healing would be deferred for many years to come. They were the nearly 4,000 Japanese Canadians who were sent into exile at the end of World War II, deported to a place devastated by the war, a land whose customs and language were foreign to many of them, Japan.
We stood in the bow of the ship and they're going under the Lions Gate Bridge, and oh my goodness, we all started to cry. And we really didn't know what was in store for us.
They didn't like us. We were foreigners to them. We were Japanese. And I thought, what the hell have we come to?
December 7th, 1941, Japan simultaneously attacked Pearl Harbor and Hong Kong. It wasn't long before Canada's Japanese population felt the consequences. It is now well known that Japanese Canadians were treated badly during the war, uprooted, interned, their property confiscated. What isn't so well known is that prominent Canadian politicians wanted to use the war as an excuse for an exercise in ethnic cleansing, for deporting as many Japanese Canadians as they could to Japan. And to make it happen, they turned to some of the best and the brightest minds in the federal bureaucracy at the time. The day after Pearl Harbor, the Canadian Navy began seizing 1,200 fishing boats owned by Japanese Canadians in British Columbia. By the end of February 1942, Ottawa had decreed that every person of Japanese race living within 100 miles of the Pacific coast would be moved inland. Some remained optimistic. The Yamamoto family ran a prosperous berry farm, but they soon felt the heavy hand of authority. Bunny Yamamoto Nagamori remembers.
The Mounties used to come with their rifles drawn. Our pets were shot. They took our goats into the woods and shot them. They were taking things away, a little by little. It wasn't just out today, out tomorrow. You know, they were getting ready to get us out of there.
Able-bodied men were separated from their families to work on road gangs. By November 42, almost 21,000 Japanese Canadians were dislocated, many of them living in shanty towns and ghost towns deep in the BC wilderness. More than half a century later, one of the witnesses to the unfolding policy recalls feeling that the discrimination was driven as much by commercial jealousy as by the state of war with Japan. James Gibson, a historian, was an assistant to Prime Minister Mackenzie King at the time.
The community, by and large, was successful in business, in market gardening, in fishing. The statistics of crime by ethnicity showed that the Japanese had the best record of all. And under wartime conditions, I think there came to the surface the kind of resentment that slumbers.
Once awakened, the resentment had a devastating effect on thousands of people. They'd gone almost overnight from comfortable homes to primitive living conditions. Perhaps most shocking to them, the sale at distressed prices of their businesses, assets, and homes. It was the first sign that the powers that moved them out of their communities intended to keep them out. And far away in Ottawa, there were pressures to come up with even greater penalties to satisfy a volatile political sentiment in BC. A lot of the pressure was coming from that province's voice in the federal cabinet, Minister of Pensions and Health, Ian Mackenzie, a tireless redneck who applauded Ottawa's evolving policy on Japanese Canadians.
There's no doubt the policy was racist. It focused on people of Japanese origin. In that sense, it was a racialist policy. We did things to Japanese Canadians that we did not do to our other World War II enemies, Italians, Germans.
Historian Jack Granatstein has studied and written widely on the treatment of Japanese Canadians during the war.
The simple truth was that you had overwhelming support in British Columbia to get rid of the Japanese in 1942 and to get rid of them for good later in the war. The bureaucrats, I think, had to recognize that political reality.
The federal bureaucracy during the war was led by some of the best minds to inhabit the civil service at any time since Confederation, and the brightest of the lot was Norman Robertson, Under Secretary of State for External Affairs. Robertson grew up in British Columbia, studied at Oxford, lectured at Harvard, was a small L liberal. If anyone could exorcise the devils of racism from public policy, he had the brains to do it. But he didn't. It is becoming clear from archival documents that Norman Robertson was probably predisposed to helping reduce the Japanese Canadian population. October 1941, weeks before Pearl Harbor, he seeks advice from the head of immigration on how to keep track of Japanese Canadians who moved to Japan so they can be prevented from returning to Canada. August 1943, a memorandum to the Prime Minister with a series of proposals for reducing the Japanese Canadian population. These proposals will later become the basis for a deportation policy. December 1943, minutes of a meeting disclose he wants to survey all Canadians of Japanese ancestry to determine how many would leave voluntarily, a device which would resurface in the future. James Gibson's boss, Prime Minister Mackenzie King, was also Norman Robertson's boss. He says it was a morally complex job in difficult times.
How much ambivalence were you aware of among your colleagues? Were you yourself morally divided on this?
I had to measure anything I said on the subject, especially in 1942, 1943. I didn't quite want to put my job on the line. I got my ears pinned back a couple of times for venturing opinions where the Prime Minister said this wasn't my business, and he may have been right. But the expectation was that basically I would do what I was told, and my superiors in the department overworked many of them with too few people to carry out multiple responsibilities. They didn't have many options either.
Well, one senses in the work, the memoranda, and the advice given by people like, for example, Norman Robertson, who was one of your superiors, a certain enthusiasm for the job.
Yes, and I think that was a condition of keeping on with the job. There had to be some flavor of enthusiasm, or I think the mechanism would simply have ground to a halt. You had to keep on doing, even if you had reservations about the immediate effect, the middle range effect, perhaps less about the long-term effect.
In the work camps and farms where people were coping with the immediate effects of Ottawa's policies, the long-term effects were still unimaginable to people who still thought of themselves as Canadians. Many were like Sahai and Koto Kato. They came to Canada as teenagers, prospered in business, only to have it all taken away.
I know my father received a check in the mail from the government. And I don't know how much. But obviously it was such a small amount that I had never seen my father cry. But he had tears rolling down his cheeks, and he was just devastated.
Bunny Nagamori's parents opted to work on a Manitoba sugar beet farm. That way they could stay together. Working and living conditions were reminiscent of slavery, but nobody seemed to care.
The papers weren't interested. The media wasn't interested. They had other things to report on. I mean, who were we?
Well, who, after a while, did you think you were? I mean, you're Canadians who were not being treated like Canadians. Who did you think you were after a while?
Throwaway citizens. Unwanted. No, we were helpless, really.
Through 1943, the federal cabinet wrestled with monumental problems, but still high on the political agenda was the so-called Japanese problem. The solution was obvious, but legally challenging.
Getting rid of large numbers of Japanese Canadians would prove to be a bit more difficult than the BC bigots had hoped. A sweep of suspected security risks only netted 700 or 800, and most of those were people who were basically just disgruntled because of harsh treatment they and their families were getting. The authorities never did come up with anything remotely resembling a legitimate cause for deportation like treason. Clearly, if there were to be grounds for kicking Canadians out of their adopted or, in many cases, birth country, they were going to have to come up with something more flexible than national security. And that's when they hit upon the notion of disloyalty.
For Mackenzie King, it would be the key to the distasteful business of appeasing racists. He had received some ideas from his top advisor, Norman Robertson, but the real nuts and bolts of policy came from another Robertson, Gordon Robertson, unrelated, 26 years old and a brilliant Oxford-educated legal advisor in external affairs. March 1944, in this 10-page memorandum, he recommended dealing drastically with those who have been disloyal in order to deal justly with those Japanese who have been blameless. But he cast a wide net for the disloyal, a process that would affect thousands of people, not one of whom had ever been charged with a disloyal act. Gordon Robertson later became the top civil servant in Canada, clerk of the Privy Council. Today he's retired, convinced the wartime policy on Japanese Canadians was a victory for moderation.
Didn't it occur to you that it is a dangerous undertaking to attempt to read the state of loyalty or disloyalty of people who were being fairly passive at the time?
Yes, it's a dangerous thing. This happened about all kinds of people in all kinds of countries at that time.
Well, it happened for the Japanese in Canada, but not for the Germans. Not for the...
Well, you don't push me on that. I'm not responsible for that.
And I don't want you to feel that you're being held to account for the actions of an entire government for the World War II. But you were, in a sense, the architects.
We were the architects of a policy.
Of a policy.
Of parts of a policy. We were the architects of some recommendations. It was for the political level to decide. But we did put forward certain recommendations that we thought were reasonable in the circumstances.
Some prominent civil servants like Hugh Turnerside thought it was unreasonable and said so. He was an assistant secretary of state for external affairs but was shut out of the process and shuffled into diplomacy.
He was seen ever after as a sort of, quotes, too YMCA, a little bit too sort of Christian, not tough enough for the policy-making rigor. And people like Robertson, the two Robertsons, I guess, were tough enough. They had to do things that they didn't like, and I have no doubt at all that they didn't like them, but they had to be done because their political masters demanded that they be done.
The bureaucrats were up against racist pressures from politicians, but it was an era when bigotry seemed more tolerable. This exchange of letters between civil servants would be outrageous by today's standards. Manitoba's Assistant Deputy Minister of Public Works, a former federal bureaucrat, writes to the Assistant Deputy Minister of Labour in Ottawa. I am enjoying my work back here, however, I quite often think of what you're all up against in connection with the final solution of the Jap problem. The reply, not much progress. Then a facetious suggestion that Canada seize an island in the Pacific and put the Japanese Canadians there.
Prime Minister Mackenzie King arrived to attend the historic conference of Dominion Premier.
April 1944, the Prime Minister and his senior advisor, Norman Robertson, went to London to attend a Commonwealth Prime Ministers Conference. While at home, the machinery for dealing with their Japanese problem was finally being installed. April 19th, in this room, the Robertsons' proposals for reducing the Japanese-Canadian population by deporting the supposedly disloyal became policy. The policy the War Cabinet made here would become public in a House of Commons speech by the Prime Minister on August 4th, 1944. It had four main elements: deportation of the disloyal, encouragement of voluntary relocation to Japan, dispersion of the remaining ethnic Japanese population throughout Canada, suspension of immigration from Japan.
It was a carefully worded speech. After all, there were no legitimate security reasons for deporting Japanese Canadians, and the Prime Minister had to soft-pedal the legally and morally questionable plan to test people for disloyalty. Ultimately, political reality would require a change in tactics, but there would be no change in the overall objective: to cleanse Canada of a group deemed to be ethnic undesirables. The new tactic would be persuasion, friendly and otherwise.
For the Japanese Canadians in the camps, any doubt about what was really going on vanished in February 1945. A repatriation survey offered two choices. They could permanently relocate east of the Rockies, or they could go to Japan. For many, there was no real choice. It seemed they were no more welcome east of the Rockies than in BC. What they didn't know was that choosing Japan would be seen as an expression of disloyalty, which could block any attempt to come back. By March 1945, the bureaucratic wheels were turning quickly. A recently declassified document reveals survey supervisors were told there would be career brownie points for persuading people to leave for Japan. By August, 7,000 adults with over 3,000 dependents signed repatriation papers. The war was almost over, but 10,000 people were facing deportation. They included people like Frank Yamashita and his family. He'd lived in Vancouver for 20 years, was married to a Canadian, and had 5 Canadian children. In happier times, he'd built the Japanese merchant's float for the 1937 parade marking the coronation of King George VI. He agreed to leave because he felt that he had no future in Canada. His wife, Mitsuko, and his daughter, Kay, never understood why they had to go.
We're Canadian, why do I have to go to Japan? But my husband was born in Japan, that's why.
My father, being a Japanese, he knew that he was not going to find a job at that time of the war, right after the war. They knew that it was something against Japanese too. You know, Japanese started the war. So he knew he wasn't going to get that job. And he knew he had to support his children too, so actually he had no choice.
Bunny Nagamori's parents couldn't face starting all over again in eastern Canada. They felt they had to leave.
Well, we couldn't let Mom and Dad go by themselves. Dad wasn't well, neither was Mom. We had to look after them. How? I don't know. By being there. If we had all said, no, we're not going, you go by yourself, they would have been heartbroken.
For the young Gordon Robertson, responsibility ended with the drafting of policy advice. He says he was unaware that other officials were preparing long lists of people to deport.
I've never seen such a thing. I have no idea.
But what on earth did you think that the translation of this policy into action would mean for the 23,000 individuals that would be affected?
One knew that it was going to be translated into action, of course, but the question for the government was, what was the policy? Then it was for whatever the instruments were to carry out the policy. Now, this is perfectly normal. There's nothing difficult about that, nothing unusual.
Awful crimes are committed in the world by virtue of that kind of dissociation.
It's not a matter of dissociation. It's a matter of functions being handled in the Department of External Affairs about external affairs policy, in the RCMP about security, in the Army about handling of combat. Certainly the Department of External Affairs knew nothing about individuals, had no information about who did what, who was of what opinion. We had no contact with that at all.
But among the documents that crossed Gordon Robertson's desk were lists of potential deportees, embellished with a careful recitation of misdemeanors to demonstrate their disloyalty, for which, in this letter, Gordon Robertson thanked the vigilant public servants. But 50 years later, he has no recollection of them.
We didn't see any lists. We were not responsible for individuals. We were responsible for some aspects of policy.
The atomic bomb brought a prompt end to the war with Japan. As Allied officers accepted the surrender of the Japanese emperor, Canadian diplomats were inquiring about when Japan could start receiving the deportees. In Ottawa, a parade marked the opening of Parliament in September of 1945. The Liberals had a new mandate. But Mackenzie King was determined to carry out the deportations under special powers of the War Measures Act, which would run out at the end of the year. This was to avoid a parliamentary challenge on the legality of the project and public questions about whether it was necessary at all. On December 15, 1945, 2 weeks before the expiry of the War Measures Act, the Cabinet met here and passed orders in Council permitting them at any time within the next year to deport disloyal Japanese Canadians and to strip many of them of their citizenship.
I think it was a case of a kind of momentum that developed out of not quite a panic mentality, but uncertainty and I suppose the political necessity of trying to keep opinion in British Columbia on the side of the national government in Ottawa. And if seeing it through meant sending several hundred people back to Japan, that was what the situation required.
And at the end of the day, they sent 4,000
yes.
people back to Japan.
I think there were some regrets about this late in the day, but I always thought there was an unwillingness to turn back once having started on it, and some built-in concern that what happened to the 4,000 people was not primarily a Canadian concern.
British Columbia celebrated a Diamond Jubilee July 1st, 1946, but there was a conspicuous difference from past parades. There were no Japanese floats and no Japanese faces in the crowd. 13,000 British Columbians of Japanese ancestry had moved east of the Rockies. Another 4,000 were bound for a more distant destination.
Christmas Eve, 1946, the last boatload of exiles sailed for Japan. The Lions Gate Bridge would be the last they'd see of their homeland for a long time, if not forever. The 4,000 who left, mostly Canadian citizens by adoption or by birth, were defeated by Canada's official policy of discrimination. They were sick, tired, and disillusioned by years of harassment. But the ordeal that lay ahead of them would be even worse.
The war had been catastrophic for Japan. The deportees found that disease, malnutrition, and starvation were commonplace.
The smell, the stench. There was a lot of injured people. Oh, God. Scabs on their heads, unwashed bodies, people picking up whatever they could from the ground.
Like many of the deportees, Bunny Nagamori couldn't speak Japanese. She survived by working for the Allied occupation forces. Others in her family weren't so fortunate.
How did this whole experience affect your parents?
Well, they died. They died of a broken heart, I'm sure. See, the land that Dad was counting on was taken over by the Japanese government to grow food for the people of Japan. So when we got there, it was gone. So, it was twice that he had lost what he thought he had. So I'm sure it was just a broken heart. They just couldn't fight anymore.
The Yamashita family lived in one room, scrounging food from unfriendly relatives, mocked in school for speaking English, the language of the conqueror. Kay Yamashita Miki recalls how she felt on discovering her mother was pregnant.
I guess as a 9-year-old, I was asking my mother, why are you having another baby? And she actually cried. I said, we don't have any food with just 5 brothers and sisters. And she cried, and I know after a few days after that, during the night, I heard her crying so many times. I felt so guilty. Why did I ask that question? But I guess as a 9-year-old, I didn't think of the effect that would have on my mother.
I'm not going to go around and wring my hands and all the rest of it and say, mea culpa, mea culpa. I did the best I could in the circumstances of the time. I served a man that I thought was absolutely first class, Norman Robertson.
Today, Gordon Robertson feels that bad as it might have been, it could have been worse.
It was 1/6, say, of the total population. It was, less than that, about 1/6. Not a large part, not something that justifies a generalization.
Well, what could have been worse? How
Total deportation.
Of everybody?
Total deportation.
That would have taken a political act of incalculable evil.
There was a lot of evil done on the Japanese side, and you've got to remember that it's very easy now to make the distinctions between Japanese Canadians and Japanese. We can make that. During the war, with passions high, it would have been not difficult at all to get a decision for total deportation.
Based entirely on race?
I suppose.
By early 1947, Mackenzie King was feeling a strong political backlash for the draconian treatment of the deported Japanese Canadians, so he announced a partial repeal of the orders in council that legalized it. Some cabinet ministers still wanted the deportations to continue, including the man who would be his successor in the Prime Minister's office, Lui Sonora King. King's diary entry for January 22, 1947. Sonora fought strongly and bravely for deporting practically all who could be deported, including some Canadian citizens, on the score that they would increase in population, and demands would be made later to have the Japanese in Canada given the same rights as the white population. In Japan, some of the deportees were already making inquiries about how to return to Canada. Half a century later, nobody knows for sure how many succeeded. Those who did had a struggle. May 4th, 1950, a deputy minister, Arthur McNamara, is telling his minister the return of deportees was a matter on which there should be masterly inactivity. The masterly inactivity lasted into the late 50s. Irene Su Yuki had been deported with her parents in August 1946. She got back in 49, but her parents were stuck there. In 1959, she started trying to bring her widowed father home.
It took perhaps half a year correspondence, and finally they gave me permission to have him return to Canada. But I think it was about a month too late, because in the meantime, my father was in an accident and he died.
The Yamashita family stayed in Japan for 21 years. They could only afford to come back when Frank Yamashita retired and invested all his retirement savings in the return to the land he never ceased to consider home. It was the fulfillment of a promise that comforted them through their long exile.
One day, I'll take you all back. One day, I'll take you all back. That keeps us going, you know. But finally, we made it. Yeah.